the 12th of May 1943, El Zaroura, Tunisia. The furnace heat of the North African spring was already relentless. Generaloberst Hans-Jürgen von Arnim stood on a dusty ridge, the air thick with the smell of spent cordite and defeat. Just hours earlier, the last remnants of the Afrika Korps had surrendered, marking the end of the Axis presence in Africa. Von Arnim was a captive now, the highest-ranking German general taken in the massive Tunisian collapse. He maintained a rigid dignity, his field marshal's baton clutched in one hand, a desperate symbol of an authority already dissolved. Around him, thousands of German and Italian soldiers were being processed by stunned Allied troops. The scale of the defeat was total, crushing 250,000 Axis lives into prisoner columns. Von Arnim still believed in the Führer. He believed in the total, unyielding power of the Third Reich. Like many of his peers, he believed the American and British propaganda describing German defeat was a lie. He expected hardship, brutality, and the meagre rations described by Goebbels' ministry for captured German heroes. What he and the other captured high officers were about to face was not hardship, but a deliberate, psychological assault. A journey across the Atlantic into a nation they believed was weak and decadent, setting the stage for a dramatic shattering of their ideological armor. The surrender in Tunisia was not merely a defeat. It was a military catastrophe that dwarfed even Stalingrad in terms of captured personnel. While the Eastern Front consumed millions, the capture of 250,000 elite fighting men in North Africa effectively sterilized the Mediterranean theater for Hitler, opening the path for the invasion of Italy. Among the human debris of that surrender were over 24 generals, a strategic catch of immense intellectual value to the Allies. The men captured represented the core of German military doctrine and experience: tank commanders, logistics experts, and strategic planners. Their very presence was a deep intelligence trove. Critically, their immediate removal from the European theatre was paramount. They held knowledge of coastal defences, the readiness of forces, and the psychological state of the Wehrmacht after its first mass defeat by Western allies. The plan was swift and secretive. Operation Legacy. High-value prisoners, the generals, select colonels, and U-boat commanders were not to be housed in the overcrowded British camps. They were destined for the United States. This logistical feat, transporting senior enemy officers across an ocean still crawling with U-boats, speaks to the supreme confidence and logistical muscle of the American war machine. In the late spring and early summer of 1943, these generals were bundled onto transports. The sea voyage itself was a psychological crucible. Submariners, who had spent months hunting Allied convoys, now found themselves part of one. Tank commanders, who had dominated the desert terrain, were now confined to the lower decks of troop carriers. For General Walther Nering, captured earlier during the collapse, and von Arnim, the journey was a profound disorientation. They had been told of Allied weakness. They had been assured the Atlantic supply lines were being strangled. Yet, their own crossing was uneventful, protected by a vast, silent armada they rarely glimpsed. The sheer volume of traffic, the constant, visible flow of men and material heading toward Europe, began the subtle erosion of their reality. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Dr. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda, was busy manufacturing a necessary lie. The German public needed an explanation for the loss of an army. The narrative crafted was simple and vicious. The defeat was a betrayal by Italian allies, and the capture was a descent into barbaric conditions. Goebbels depicted American camps as brutal, starved prisons, assuring families that the captured soldiers and generals faced daily torment under a vengeful enemy. This narrative served a dual purpose. It excused the military failure and bolstered the German home front's resolve against the inhumane allies. The generals themselves, steeped in Nazi ideology and insulated by rank, carried this propaganda with them. They expected a prison experience that confirmed the inherent decadence and cruelty of the democracies they had fought. They expected to be treated as defeated, dangerous enemies, not as potential intelligence assets or, more critically, as unwitting political pawns. The United States, however, was preparing a sophisticated, deliberate program for these men, designed to dismantle their illusions one measured, comfortable step at a time. The policy was strategic. aiming not for punishment, but for insight and ultimate psychological capitulation. The long, uneventful voyage across the Atlantic concluded not in the chaos of a battlefield, but on the quiet docks of New York City, where the German officers encountered the first undeniable sign of a reality far removed from their propaganda-fueled expectations. The arrival of the German generals in America was immediately classified as a special project. This was not routine prisoner processing. It was a high-stakes intelligence operation disguised as routine military bureaucracy. The United States Army, specifically its Military Intelligence Service, recognized the incredible opportunity, a concentrated collection of the Wehrmacht's most senior minds, isolated from the noise of the Reich. The overarching strategic concern was simple: speed the end of the war. To do this, the Allies needed to know the enemy's breaking points and its remaining capabilities. The plan developed by the MIS was counterintuitive to the natural human desire for vengeance. Instead of mistreatment, the generals were to be provided with conditions that strictly adhered to, and often exceeded, the Geneva Convention for Officers. Camps like Fort Hunt in Virginia, where the interrogation began, and later Camp Clinton and Papago Park, were chosen for their isolation and suitability for listening operations. The captured generals were granted privileges rarely afforded to common prisoners: officers' quarters, access to reading materials, and above all, ample, nourishing food. This policy was less about kindness and more about manipulation. A comfortable, well-fed prisoner talks more freely than a miserable, suspicious one. They were to be made complacent. This measured American approach stood in direct contradiction to the narrative being screamed across Germany by Dr. Goebbels. The Minister of Propaganda had a desperate need to maintain the home front's morale amidst mounting defeats. He weaponized the distance. He filled the information void with monstrous fictions. Goebbels's most consistent theme was the moral and material weakness of the American enemy. The United States was, according to his broadcasts, a mongrel nation crippled by racial strife, industrial strikes, and severe resource shortages. Its soldiers were soft, its productivity exaggerated. German generals in U.S. custody, he promised the public, were being starved, beaten, and held in cages to demonstrate American spite. This maintained a perception of German moral superiority and justified the continued fight. Crucially, the generals themselves had internalized this propaganda. They genuinely believed in the weakness of the democratic superpower. They had seen American equipment on the battlefield, but the ideological framework they inhabited denied the possibility of American supremacy. They expected to see a nation struggling to feed its own people, let alone its prisoners. Their belief system was reinforced by every word broadcast from Berlin. This deep-seated ideological conditioning was the target of the American strategy. The MIS knew that the sheer, unavoidable reality of the United States' staggering material abundance would deliver a psychological shock that no interrogation could match. The moment of their introduction to American soil, and specifically to their first American meal, was set to be the first, quiet detonation in this campaign of psychological warfare, forcing the generals to reconcile their propaganda-fed beliefs with an overwhelming, undeniable, and deeply unsettling reality. The captured German officers arrived in America, deeply insulated by dogma. These men, products of the Prussian military tradition and now elevated by the Führer, viewed themselves as representatives of a superior, ascendant power. Their defeat in Tunisia was not seen as a systemic failure, but as a temporary setback caused by lack of resources and overextended supply lines failings they attributed to the strategic incompetence of their Italian allies and Hitler's meddling, not to the power of the democracies. This mindset was crucial. Generals like von Arnim and Nering maintained a rigid sense of duty, convinced that the war's true turning point, the crushing of the Soviet Union, and the total victory over the Western Allies was still ahead. This belief allowed them to treat their American captors with a mixture of professional disdain and smug superiority. They expected to return to the Reich triumphant, and until then, they would uphold the honor of the Wehrmacht. This arrogance made them poor observers of their new environment, blind to the clues that contradicted their worldview, and thus ideal subjects for the American psychological campaign. The American handling of these high-value POWs was governed by a calculated policy of strategic kindness. The goal was not to break their bodies, but to break their beliefs and, in doing so, elicit critical intelligence. At the initial reception centers, officers were housed in clean, well-maintained barracks, provided with proper medical care, and accorded the respect due their rank under the Geneva Convention. This treatment served multiple intelligence purposes. First, it fostered a sense of misplaced security, making the officers more inclined to discuss matters among themselves, conversations that were invariably recorded by hidden microphones. Second, the absence of expected brutality was itself a form of psychological pressure. It stripped away the comfortable narrative of the barbaric enemy and replaced it with a complex, unsettling reality. The interrogators understood that the generals had prepared themselves for physical hardship. They had not prepared themselves for comfort. This generosity was an intelligence tool, a lubricant for extracting insights into future German operations, technology, and internal political dynamics. The transatlantic voyage itself delivered the first quiet shock. For months, German propaganda had insisted the U-boat fleet was winning the Battle of the Atlantic, crippling Allied supply lines. Yet, the generals crossed in large, modern transports, surrounded by an endless convoy of ships, seemingly invulnerable, moving vast quantities of men and material effortlessly. General officers who had struggled for every drop of fuel in Africa witnessed a logistics system operating at a scale they could scarcely comprehend. The American machine was not collapsing. It was mobilizing on an unimaginable level. The ship's mess, though adhering to wartime regulations, offered a consistency and quality that was already better than the combat rations the generals had been issuing their own men in Tunisia. When the officers finally sighted the coastline of America, they did not see a war-strained, impoverished nation. They saw the endless, bustling expanse of New York City's port infrastructure area, physical monument to industrial power that had seemingly barely noticed the war across the sea. This visible reality of American logistical supremacy began the slow, internal process of doubt, preparing the ground for the devastating realization that was to come upon their first proper meal. The shock was the sheer, visible wealth and unburdened scale of the enemy. The cornerstone of the American strategy was the first meal. It was a deliberately curated experience, designed to instantly and violently dismantle the ideological foundation of the generals. The food was not necessarily luxurious, but it was abundant. It was served in quantities that were robust, featuring ample meat, fresh vegetables, butter, sugar, and coffee staples that had become severe luxuries or outright impossibilities in the German Reich after 4 years of war and total mobilization. For the German officers, who believed they were fighting a world starving for resources, the sight of this unrationed bounty was more shocking than any direct confrontation. In Europe, the German war economy had begun to cannibalize its own population, issuing increasingly meager ration cards. Here, in the enemy's heartland, food was being served with a careless, almost insulting generosity. This meal was a visible, tangible measure of American industrial supremacy. It spoke volumes about a war machine that could feed its millions of combat troops, its home front, and its captured generals, all without apparent strain. It was the first undeniable proof that Goebbels had lied, not merely about battlefield tactics, but about the fundamental capacity of the American enemy. The realization that their own troops were often hungry, while their prison guards and their own prisoners ate heartily, planted a seed of profound and crippling doubt. In Berlin, Goebbels was fighting a desperate battle on the psychological front. He had staked his propaganda on the narrative of the West's impending collapse. The news of high-ranking generals being captured and shipped to America presented a deep crisis. If the truth of their treatment became known, it would instantly expose the central lie of resource scarcity and moral decay. Goebbels' response was a relentless escalation of the lie. The narratives focused not just on brutality, but on the necessity of American barbarism, arguing that the US was too brittle and desperate to treat its enemies honorably. The propaganda machine insisted that any reports of humane treatment were simply US lies, designed to destabilize the German home front. The difficulty, however, was in the details. Goebbels could not account for the sheer number of generals or the consistent, low-level flow of accurate information that occasionally filtered back through neutral channels, leading to increasing internal distrust within the German High Command about the status of their captured comrades. This psychological war played out entirely within the minds of the German public. For the generals in America, however, the lie was already disintegrating under the weight of reality. The propaganda had promised suffering and privation. America delivered comfort and abundance, a distinction that rendered Goebbels' entire ministry functionally irrelevant to the very men he sought to control. The American soldiers assigned to guard these high-value prisoners were often young men, mostly non-combat personnel, or men deemed fit for garrison duty. Their experience was another critical layer of the psychological operation. They were instructed to be polite, professional, and strictly adherent to the rules. This professionalism, combined with a casual confidence, contrasted sharply with the harsh discipline and rigid dogma the German officers expected. The American guards were well-fed, dressed in quality uniforms, and exhibited a relaxed demeanor that spoke of a life free from the constant strain of total war. They were the visible embodiment of the vast, unburdened society the generals had been taught to despise. This interaction broke down the last barrier of the general's ideological defense, the myth of the soft, undisciplined American soldier. Here were men who, without harsh discipline or ideological zealotry, managed a massive prison compound with relaxed efficiency. The contrast between the Wehrmacht's required fanaticism and the Americans' casual effectiveness was a final, stinging realization for the German command. All these angles converged on a single point: the moment of encounter. The generals were now standing on enemy soil, surrounded by a civilization that appeared untouched and limitless, their worldview hanging by a thread. That thread would finally snap when they sat down at the table and faced the undeniable, material truth of their defeat. The captured generals were transported covertly to the eastern seaboard, typically disembarking in ports like Newport News, Virginia, or New York, before being moved inland. For Generaloberst von Arnim and his fellow high-ranking officers, the final journey led them to a specialized facility, perhaps Fort Hunt, designated as a secret reception and interrogation center. The date was late May 1943. The movement itself was clinical, efficient, and jarringly silent. There were no crowds, no angry mobs, and no signs of the chaos and war strain Goebbels had promised. The highways were smooth, the trucks were new, and the landscape they passed was overwhelmingly green and pastoral, utterly untouched by the conflict raging 3,000 miles away. The German officers, accustomed to the bombed-out cities and resource depletion of the Reich, registered this reality with a slow, creeping dread. Upon arrival at the camp, the visual shock intensified. They were not marched into barbed wire enclosures or makeshift tents. They were directed into orderly, well-constructed wooden barracks, clean, painted, and properly furnished. These were not the dilapidated, starved cages of propaganda. They were officers' quarters, meeting the standards of a peacetime army base. The first interaction with the American command staff was crucial. The American officers, led by a colonel or major, addressed the Germans with formality and correct military protocol, ensuring that their commissioned rank was recognized. They were processed swiftly, their personal effects inventoried, and their privileges outlined, including writing materials and the right to congregate in a common room. The tone was professional, distant, and utterly devoid of malice or vengeance. This lack of hatred was profoundly unsettling. The generals had prepared for confrontation, for the chance to demonstrate their stoicism under duress. Instead, they were met with an impersonal, overwhelming competence. The American captors behaved not like desperate enemies, but like confident managers of an infinite operation. They carried the air of men who knew the war was already decided, and that the captured Germans were merely administrative tasks. The initial hours in the camp were spent in observation. The German officers gathered in their common rooms, speaking in hushed, tense tones, trying to reconcile their training with their environment. They noticed the quality of the glass in the windows, the thickness of the wood in the doors, the fresh laundry service that appeared with effortless regularity. These were small details, but they added up to a monumental picture of a society under no material strain whatsoever. The final psychological threshold came with the sun setting and the order for the evening meal. The officers, driven by military habit and genuine hunger, proceeded to the mess hall. They expected institutional gruel, limited portions, or perhaps a deliberate insult disguised as food. Their stomachs churned with the anxiety of the unknown. They filed into the large, brightly lit hall. The tables were set with actual cutlery, not tin mess kits. The air was warm, not damp and cold. And then they saw the line. The long tables were laden with steam trays, piled high with a bewildering array of food. The sheer volume was staggering, an immediate, physical rejection of Goebbels' every promise. The moment they stepped into that room, the intellectual battle was already lost. Now, the material reality of America was poised to deliver the final, devastating blow. The German generals approached the serving line, their rigid posture masking profound internal conflict. They saw the steam trays, not potatoes and watery soup, but vast quantities of roasted meat soften, roast beef or pork, loin alongside fresh, colourful salads, butter, whole loaves of fresh white bread, and bowls of fruit. This was not wartime rationing. This was the American standard of military feeding, a testament to an economy that had mobilized without sacrificing fundamental domestic comfort. The menu that night, or during one of their initial days, was a calculated insult to the Nazi war effort. General Nering, an experienced panzer commander, reportedly stared at the serving trays with genuine disbelief. The men loaded their trays with portions that would have been a month's ration for an average German family back home. They sat down, the metal trays clanking softly, surrounded by the quiet hum of the mess hall. This first bite was the moment of the psychological breakthrough. The food was warm, nourishing, and seemingly endless. The quality of the white bread, the ubiquitous butter, and the availability of sugar and coffee, all extreme luxuries in the Reich, spoke louder than 1,000 propaganda broadcasts. The realization struck them not as a matter of tactics or strategy, but as a material, visceral fact. Their enemy was wealthy beyond measure. Their defeat was not due to an accidental setback or a lack of courage. It was due to confronting a civilization capable of sustaining a war effort on two fronts, while simultaneously feeding its prisoners better than the German army could feed its own fighting men. The generals had internalized the belief that America was a flimsy, short-sighted democracy, its industrial capacity a myth, its people weak. This meal proved the opposite. A nation that could afford such casual, almost wasteful, abundance for its captives was a nation whose productive capacity was truly limitless. This industrial superiority was the true, silent weapon that evening. In the transcripts of conversations secretly recorded by the military intelligence service, the profound shock became evident. The generals spoke in stunned whispers. They discussed the fact that if America could produce this amount of food, what must their tank, aircraft, and ammunition production look like? The reality was exponentially greater than their most pessimistic military estimates. For men like General von Arnim, the experience was a complete ideological trauma. Their ideological certainty had rested on the fundamental premise of German superiority and the imminent collapse of the decadent democracies. Now, they were eating physical proof that the foundation of the Reich's claim that it alone could organize a successful modern state was a lie. The meal didn't just satisfy their hunger, it starved their ideology. The climax was silent, internal, and total. The physical comfort delivered a psychological blow far more damaging than any torture could have achieved. The generals began to realize that the war, for them, was not just lost on the Tunisian sands, it was lost here, on the abundant, unburdened tables of America. This realization would lead immediately to a significant intelligence yield, as the men, demoralized and stripped of their ideological armor, began to talk openly about their despair and the true condition of the Wehrmacht. The strategic importance of this single meal was immeasurable. It confirmed to the highest echelon of captured German command that their country was fighting an unwinnable war against an inexhaustible foe. This profound shift in perception would rapidly transition into invaluable intelligence and, ultimately, contribute to the broader psychological breakdown of German loyalty within the American prison system. The psychological shock delivered by American abundance translated almost immediately into an unparalleled intelligence harvest. The high-value prisoners, stripped of their ideological certainty, became prolific sources of information. The realization that victory was impossible led many to abandon the tight military secrecy that had defined their careers. The hidden microphones placed throughout the general's quarters at Fort Hunt and other facilities captured thousands of hours of unguarded conversation. The transcripts from these listening operations, collectively known as the MIS box documents, revealed the immediate psychological fallout. The conversations were marked by increasing fatalism, genuine fear, and technical discussions that inadvertently handed the Allies a roadmap to the Wehrmacht's vulnerabilities. Crucially, the generals revealed the truth about German morale, the internal struggles between the Wehrmacht and the Nazi Party, and most valuable details of new technologies and defensive preparations. General von Arnim, in private conversations, revealed his frustration with Hitler's strategic overreach, moving far past professional critique into outright disillusionment. A report summary from the Military Intelligence Service concerning the general's conversations noted the consistent theme of material shock. The prisoners' initial reaction to the American logistical and material capacity has been a consistent factor in their immediate psychological decline. They had been told of a struggling nation. They confront a limitless one. The sight of unrationed foodstuffs and the obvious industrial capacity of the United States has had a greater demoralizing effect than any direct interrogation could achieve. They now believe the war is materially unwinnable. The casualty count here was entirely psychological. The war lost in Tunisia was one thing. The war lost at the mess hall table was another. The generals suffered a catastrophic loss of confidence in their political leadership, their propaganda, and their mission. The strategic consequences were profound. The intelligence gathered offered the Allies detailed insight into the weaknesses of the German coastal defences, information critical for the subsequent invasions of Sicily and mainland Italy, and eventually, the planning for Operation Overlord. For Goebbels' ministry, the failure was total. The officers who were supposed to return after the war as stoic survivors of American savagery were instead internalizing the reality of American power. Their loss of faith, even if confined to the prison camps, represented the complete failure of the Nazi psychological defense mechanism among its elite. These generals began to realize that their devotion to the Führer had led them not to a glorious new era, but to an embarrassing, comfortable captivity in a nation they had tragically underestimated. Their letters home, though censored, sometimes contained subtle indications of their condition, which further contradicted the official line. They were well, they were healthy, they were treated correctly, a message that, in wartime Germany, was strangely subversive. It planted the very first seeds of doubt in the minds of the German military establishment about the absolute truth of their leaders' pronouncements. The strategic value of this capitulation was measured in months saved and lives spared for the Allies. The broader consequences of the high-value German POW internment went beyond immediate intelligence. The policy of strategic kindness fundamentally shaped the American approach to handling prisoners of war for the rest of the conflict. The success of the MIS operation, particularly the use of material reality as a psychological weapon, reinforced the idea that adherence to international law, coupled with advanced intelligence techniques, yielded superior results compared to brutality. The program became a template for managing captured Axis elites, demonstrating that psychological security and comfort often led to greater strategic vulnerability. The American policy essentially turned the generals' own ideological framework against them. By receiving excellent treatment, they were forced to acknowledge the vast, unburdened power of the enemy they were told was weak and decadent. The generals' forced consumption of American abundance created an internal contradiction that plagued German military memory for decades. After the war, when the generals were eventually repatriated most by mid-1947, they faced a Germany shattered by defeat, poverty, and the physical reality of Allied bombing. They returned to a nation where the narrative of German military honor was paramount, often insisting the war was lost only due to Hitler's betrayals or lack of resources. The truth of their experience in America, the ease, the abundance, the evidence of overwhelming power was largely suppressed or subtly altered in their memoirs and post-war interviews. It did not fit the desired narrative of heroic struggle against impossible odds. To admit that America was fighting the war while comfortably feeding its prisoners was to admit a total foundational defeat based on material and industrial inferiority, a more painful truth than simple tactical failure. This experience, however, had a lasting diplomatic consequence: the clear, documented adherence to the Geneva Convention in the treatment of high-ranking officers provided the U.S. with moral leverage and set a high standard for conduct, contrasting sharply with Soviet treatment of German prisoners in the East. Ultimately, the first meal of the German generals in America was a quiet technological demonstration. It demonstrated the overwhelming, unmatched capacity of the American industrial machine, a capacity that became known as the arsenal of democracy. It was a testament to the fact that in total war, the ability to produce and sustain, not just fight, was the decisive factor. The generals arrived in America believing in the strength of their ideology. They left convinced of the strength of American industry. The sight of the unrationed bounty, the healthy American guards, and the untouched landscape was the ultimate piece of strategic intelligence provided to the captured enemy high command. It revealed the sheer impossibility of German victory. What the incident truly revealed, therefore, was the fragility of propaganda when confronted with undeniable material evidence, leading us to consider what the ultimate lessons of such a subtle, devastating confrontation truly are. The incident of the German general's first meal in America stands as a profound case study in the dynamics of total war and psychological conflict. It was a confrontation not of rifles and tanks, but of ideology versus industry. Warfare is often seen through the lens of battlefield heroism and tactical genius, but the reality of the Second World War was ultimately decided by the silent, relentless turning of the production line. These generals, highly trained and deeply loyal, had based their entire strategic outlook on a lithe manufactured certainty of American material decay. When faced with the incontrovertible evidence of America's limitless capacity, personified by an ordinary, abundant meal, their entire worldview collapsed. The psychological breakthrough demonstrates a crucial lesson in leadership and propaganda. Falsehoods cannot sustain a total war effort when confronted with overwhelming material reality. Goebbels' words evaporated the moment they were contradicted by the sight of endless butter, meat, and fresh bread. The American policy of strategic humanity was superior to any policy of outright vengeance, because it leveraged the enemy's own cognitive biases against them. The generals learned, not through defeat in a single battle, but through the mundane reality of a mess hall, that they were fighting a power that was not merely stronger, but existed on a different, unassailable scale. This quiet, non-violent moment, repeated dozens of times across American POW camps, was one of the decisive turning points of the war's psychological dimension. It proved that the arsenal of democracy was not just a factory floor. It was a state of being, a boundless potential that the rigidly confined, resource-starved Reich could never match. The legacy of the meal is the profound revelation that in a global conflict, the quality of a nation's supply chain can be a more devastating weapon than any newly designed tank. It revealed the sheer impossibility of German victory. The war was won, in part, by the generous plating of American food.